Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches Bava Daf Chaf, and we're starting 5 lines down. The Gemara says, Amar Ilfa. Ilfa says, Behema Birshus Harabim. If there's an animal that's in Rishus Harabim, Upashta Savara ve'achla me'al gabe chaverta, and this animal reaches over onto the back of another animal and eats food, the halacha is chayeves. It's a little bit of an oddball scenario because typically we assume that in Rishus Harabim you're only going to be putter, and that in Rishus Nizak you're going to be chayev. Here it's a little bit of a blend. Animal number one eats off the back of animal number two. The halacha is your chayev. And the Gemara postulates as to why this might be. The Gemara says, "My time," because gabe chaverta, the back of the second animal, is kechatzer anizak dami, is similar to being on the Chatzar of Nizak, even though, of course, it's located Birshus Hamazik, Birshus Harabim, but Lamaisa, the back is possibly, or at least halachically considered, a different location. The Gemara suggests perhaps Lema Misayele, perhaps this actually is a source for a similar Mari Makom. What is that similar Mari Makom? That Haisa Kupaso Mufshelas La'achorav. Let's say that I had a basket that I had slung over my shoulder. Upashta Tzavarav Achla Mimenu. And an animal eats out of the basket that's on my back. So perhaps that's similar to our case of an animal that eats off of another animal's back in Chayeves. Says the Gemara, no keda Amar Rava. Really, that case is not this case because when that's talking about pekofetzes, we're talking about an animal that jumps, and that's an abnormal way for an animal to jump. Animals don't usually eat while they're jumping. Hachanami pekofetzes, and really the reason even in our case is different. Where both of these cases are talking about kofetzes, but without that misbehavior, we would have assumed our regular rule that birshus harabim that you would be pater. The heicha itmar de Rava. Where do we see Rava's source? Where do we see the source that Rava tells us that bekofetzes the halacha is different? Says the Gemara, aha. It applies to the following: 12 lines down on Chaf Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, where do we see that Rava holds of a case of kofetzes where there's jumping? The Gemara says, Damar Rav Oshaya, behema birshus harabim, alcha ve'achla betura. That if you have an animal that is in rishus harabim, so if the animal was halcha v'achla, it's walking and eating, so then pater. And then the Gemara says on the other side, but amdav v'achla chayevet. But if the animal is standing still and eating, so then the halacha is that you're going to be chayev. Asks the Gemara the obvious question: Ma'ishna halcha to orchehu. When an animal is eating while walking, that's normal. Amdanami orchehu. We're standing still, walking. The animals eat and move. Animals eat and walk. It says the Gemara, here is where Rava says his din of Amar Rava bekofetzes, where we see this precedent, this case of an animal that's eating bekofetzes, and therefore the halacha would be different if an animal is that. Then they would be pater in that case of halcha. Of course, halcha here now means kofetzes according to Rava's reinterpretation. So that was question number one of tonight. If we have an animal that's eating off of the back of another animal. And the reason why this is a kasha in the first place is because we would have assumed that since he's located Birshus Harabim, that you're pater. Now he's eating off of the back of an animal, Birshus Harabim. The Gemara says perhaps it's like Birshus Hanizak, and therefore you'd be chayiv. Kamash Malanda, no, really this case is not talking about that. Really the case is talking about kofetzes where the animal has jumped, and the Gemara presented the precedent for Rava. A third of the way down, the Gemara says, Boy Reb Zera, Miskal Gel Mahu. If the food is rolling, does the din change? Now we have to understand what this case means. Hey Chidami, what is the case of the food rolling? Says the Gemara, Kigon de Kaima Amir, you have some straw that's Birshus Hayachid. The straw is located Birshus Hayachid, and Miskal Gel Va'asim Birshus Hayachid, Birshus Harabim. And now the food is moving over the threshold from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. So how do we assess, the Gemara wants to know, how do we assess whether or not it's in Rishus HaRabim, in which case you'd be pater, or if it's Rishus HaNizak, in which case you'd be chayiv? So the Gemara says, what's the din? The Gemara responds with a brisa. Tashma, the Tani Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia teaches a brisa. Masui, if you have a package or if you have food that's miktsasa bifnin and miktsasa b'chutz, part of the package is inside, part of the package is outside. In such a case, So what's the din? The din is achla bifnim chayeves. If while the animal is bifnim, the animal eats this food while it's bifnim, namely birshus hanizak, you're going to be chayev. And achla bachutz, if the animal was standing outside of the rishus hanizak and the rishus harabim, the din is that he's going to be ptura. My lab miskal gel va'asi. Isn't this a case scenario where perhaps the Gemara says that the animal is moving the food from one place to another, and therefore maybe that would answer our question of Reb Zera about the food rolling? The Gemara says, "Lo, that's really not how to properly understand the question of Reb Zera. Rather, ema achla al bifnim chayeves. We just look at the physical location of the animal himself. If the animal is bifnim, if the animal is on the inside of the threshold, birshus hanizak, then even if the food really is crossing over the threshold, then we'd be the owner of the behema would be chayav because he's eating birshus hanizak, and al masha bachutz ptura. But if he's eating the food while he is standing outside, then the din is he'd be pater like a regular din birshus harabim. The Gemara says, there's another possibility. Perhaps Reb Chia was talking about the psila de aspasta. Maybe we aren't talking about a case of something that's rolling from one rishus to another and the animal's eating it, but of a very, very long food that is physically placed across the threshold. Either way, we don't have a clear answer to the case of Reb Zera. That brings us halfway down to the two dots. The Gemara says, Achlaksus. What was this talking about? Let's refresh our memory by looking at the Mishnah on the previous summit on Yud Testament base. We were talking there about the classical case of Shane. And on the third line of that Mishnah, we had said something. On the third line of that Mishnah, we had said that an animal that was achlak suso kalim mit their mishalim chatzi nezek, that if an animal eats clothing or if they eat utensils, they're going to be chayav chatzi nezek. And we had learned in the Gemara that when was this true? It was only true under certain circumstances. We had learned that it's going to be pater birshus harabim. It says the Gemara, Ohaya, when we say bamed dvarim amurim, what exactly are we talking about? Amar Rab, akulhu, we're talking about all cases of the Mishnah. And that is going to be the case. If you look in our Mishnah on your Testament base on the third line, it qualifies that line. It says, Bamed dvarim amurim, birshus hanizak aval birshus harabim pater. So does that line only go, does the Bamed dvarim amurim only go on the line of achlak sus o kalim, or does it even go on the previous cases of shein mu'edes and behema mu'edes? So the Gemara says back where we are on the Chaf Amud Aleph, a little bit more than halfway down. So Rav says it's akulhu, that limitation of bamed dvarim amurim, that it only applies birshus harabim. That's when it's going to be pater. That applies to everything in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, my time. Why would it be that that's true? And the Gemara says because of the following: Kol mishane uba'acher v'shinabo pater. If you have two cases of mishane, if the Baal does something weird and then the animal does something weird, then the Baal is the one who's the problem. What does this mean? The Mefarshim here explain that when the animal ate the ksus and ate the kalim, what owner puts his clothing outside? That's not normal. Your clothing belong inside. They belong in a drawer. They belong put away. So if you were, as the Baal were Mishana, you did something odd and you left your clothes out, that's what this line means. Kol Mishana uva'acher v'shina bo, the halacha is pater. The animal is an animal. Animals can't be relied upon. So if you have a Baal who brought ksus v'kelim outside, and then the animal ate it, so then the din is that the Baal is the one who's irresponsible. Shmuel Amar, no, that's not correct. Shmuel argues with this shita of Rav, and Shmuel says, Lo shanu ela peros v'yarakos, that the din is that this only applies to peros v'yarakos, where we say that he's going to be pater, aval ksus v'kelim, but when it comes to ksus v'kelim chayeves, that in fact he would be considered chayev in such a case, that the owner of the animal who ate the ksus v'kelim would be chayev to pay the Baal. Machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Says the Gemara that v'chein amar Reish Lakish akulu, Reish Lakish agrees with Rav that the qualification of our Mishnah, when it says Bamed Dvarim Amurim, it applies to everything previous in our Mishnah, not just to the case of Ksus v'Kelim, but it also applies to the case of Shein Muedes and Behema Muedes. The Oz Reish Lakish L'Taime, they were 2/3 of the way down, 3 lines before the wide lines. And the Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish, Shtei Paros Birshus Harabim. Reish Lakish follows his own shita where he says that Birshus Harabim you'll be pater. And he does so by aligning with a shita that he has elsewhere, which is a little bit of a strange case. We'll see this Gemara again later in the Masechta a couple of times. The Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish, Shtei Paros Birshus Harabim. Imagine a scenario where there are two cows, Birshus Harabim. Achas Ravutza, Ba'achas Mehalechas. One of the cows is crouching down, and one of the cows is walking. And says the Gemara, Ba'ata Mehalechas Beravutza. The animal that's walking kicks the animal that is crouching. The halacha is Ptura. That's party line, Reish Lakish with himself. And he says that the animal that is walking is in Rishus Harabim, and it's pater. But Revutza b'mehaleches, if the animal that's crouching kicks out its front leg or its back leg, and it kicks the mehaleches and damages it, halacha is chayeves. Rabbi Yochanan argues with Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says that whereas Reish Lakish holds, like Rav, that the Bamed Dvarim Amurim of our Mishnah applies to everything prior in our Mishnah, that's not across the board. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Shanu Ela Peres Virakos. He agrees with Shmuel. So a double machlokes tanoim. We have Rav and Shmuel against Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav and Reish Lakish are the same. Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are the same. So says the Gemara, Lema, perhaps we should say that Rabbi Yochanan says perhaps he's less like the Reish Lakish afilu b'shtei paros. Does Rabbi Yochanan also argue with Reish Lakish? Not only in our case, we know they argue in our case about whether or not the Bamed Dvarim Amurim applies to our whole Mishnah or not. But would Rabbi Yochanan also argue with Reish Lakish in regards to the case of the Shtei Paros Birshus Harabim, Achas Ravutza, the Achas Mehaleches? Says the Gemara, no, lo, Olam Islay. There Rabbi Yochanan would agree, even with the Shita of Reish Lakish, about the distinctions between the Mehaleches kicking the Ravutza, the animal that's walking, which kicks the animal that's crouching where they're pater, versus the opposite, where the animal that's Ravutza, who kicks the animal that's Mehaleches, the crouching animal, kicks the regular one, the Yubi Chayeves. He does agree with that. It says the Gemara, the reason why Rabbi Yochanan distinguishes between the case of Paros, the case of Shtei Paros, where he agrees with Reish Lakish, as opposed to our case, where he disagrees with Reish Lakish, is because Ksus, when it comes to clothing, Avde Inshe Damanach Glimi Umispachi. It's possible that a person has their clothes and they put them down outside for a couple of minutes. Aval Behema Lav Urcha. When it comes to an animal crouching Birshus Harabim, that's Pasha, not normal. That's not a normal thing to do. So therefore, Rav Yochanan finally distinguishes between those two cases of our Mishnah, where at times it's reasonable for a person to put clothes outside, as opposed to an animal, Birshus Harabim, which is never Revutza. That brings us to the two dots, 4 lines into the wide lines, 3/4 of the way down on Chaf Amud Aleph. And let's continue. We'll be stopping on the top of Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, so we have another Amud to go, a little bit more. The Gemara says, if you look back at our Mishnah on Yud Testament Beis, our Mishnah had said over there that if an animal was nenes, then mishalemes basha nenes, then it pays whatever it enjoyed, whatever it benefited from. So says the Gemara V'kama, how do the payments work for Hana? The Gemara says, Rabba Omar, Dmei Amir, he only pays for straw, even if he were to have had more of a meal. He only pays for straw, but not for what is otherwise common, barley. And this is a machlokes. Rava Amar, Dmei Seorim Bizol. He even has to pay for Dmei Seorim if he ate Seorim, but he doesn't have to pay full market price. Seorim are more expensive than Amir, than straw. And he only has to pay Bizol, the lower part of the market of whatever the Dmei Seorim Bizol is, that lower market cost of the Seorim. And the Gemara brings a brisa for each one. Tanya Kavase de Rabba, Tanya Kavase de Rabba. 5 lines into the wide lines. Tanya Kavase de Rabba. Where do we see a shita like Rabba that we only pay the cost of the Amir? We only pay the cost of the straw. Says the Gemara, that's Rav Shimon ben Yochai Amrain Mishalem Ela Dmei Amir Bilvad, black on white. Rabba has a perfect shita. It's a brisa that supports his shita. That when our Mishnah on Yud Testament Beis says that you have to pay whatever your hana is, that means you have to pay for the straw that your animal ate, but not the barley. However, Tanya Kavase de Rava also has a brisa that agrees with his shita. What's the shita of Rava? Based on the brisa, Im nehenes mishalemes mashe nehenes, similar language to our Mishnah. And ketzad, how does that work? Achla kava kobayim, if an animal ate one measure or two measures of food, ein omdin tash ein omrim tishalem dmeim, you don't have to pay in full. Ela omdin kama adam rotze lehachil lebehemto davar haroila, aval pi she'eno ragil. How much would he have fed him even of the barley, even if something that he wouldn't have normally fed him? And we have to measure that, and even there, he wouldn't have to pay in full. Lefichach achla chitin, oh davar harala ptura, and he eaten something that wasn't edible. If he would have eaten barley, he has to pay bizol, whatever the lower cost is of the market. But if he would have eaten a food that's bad for him, then he would have been patur. Okay. The Gemara continues 6 lines from the bottom, and the Gemara tells us about a sugya called Zenene v'zeh chaser, Zenene v'zeh lo chaser, Zelo nene v'zeh chaser, 4 different iterations, and we're going to be learning a number of them tonight over the course of the next Amud. The Gemara says, Amar le Reb Chizda le Rami bar Chama, lo havis gabon be'urta betchuma. You weren't with us last night when we were over there in that area over there. De'iboilan mili mal yosef. Oh, we had the opportunity to ask such great shilas to the Rebbe. This is awesome chinuch. When a person goes home and they're excited about Talmud Torah, they leave an impression on their child about how excited they are. The Talmud Torah is awesome. This is especially true now where Torah is magna u'matzla. We need to not only do our part for ourselves, but to model for our children. So here the Gemara says that Rav Chizda says to Rami bar Chama, you missed out. You missed out. This was amazing. So he made Rami bar Chama excited. The Gemara says, Omar, mili mal yasa. What shilas did you ask? Please tell me. Don't leave me in the dark. I want to know what Torah you were learning. Omar le, he said, the following shilah was discussed. And he said, Hadar bechatzer chavero shalamidaita. Let's say that I live in your property without your knowledge. Sarach lehalos lo schar, o ein sarach. Of course, we're not talking about damages. We're talking about stama case. Am I allowed? Not allowed. I'm not allowed to live in your property. But if I do live in your property and you don't even know about it, am I obligated to pay you for the time that I lived in your property? So says the Gemara, Heichidami. Let's see what the case is. If you, as the owner, you weren't even planning on renting it out, and v'gavra lo avid lemegar, and I was never planning on paying rent, even if I didn't live in your property. Zelo nehne v'zelo chaser. I didn't benefit because I wasn't planning on paying rent no matter where I lived. You didn't lose because you weren't planning on collecting rent no matter what was going on. So that can't be the case because that case is obvious where money should not change hands. In other words, it's not categorical that if I live in your property, I automatically have to pay you. In a case scenario where you aren't planning on renting and I wasn't planning on paying rent, no reason why you should be paid because I didn't lose any. I wasn't really nehne because I wasn't planning on paying anyways, and you weren't planning on renting. Ella says the Gemara, if you want to say it's b'chatzer the kaima la'agra v'gabra da'avid lemegar zenene v'zechaser. The opposite extreme is also not a shaila. That can't be what the shaila was, because if you were planning on renting and I just squatted in your apartment without permission, and I was planning on paying rent, pashat that's asur, and of course I'd be obligated to pay rent. If I see a sign that says, Shmuel's apartment is for rent, and I say, great, I'm just going to go live in his apartment and not pay rent, I'm a gana, pashat that I have to pay. So it says the Gemara, lo tzricha. What was the shaila that we asked that required a little bit of a more sophisticated answer? So to this, the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, lo tzricha ala b'chatzer v'lo kaima le'agra. We're talking about a case where you, the owner of the apartment, you were not expecting rent, but v'gavra de'avid lemegar. But I was planning on paying rent. So this one is an in-between case. It's not either extreme of zenen of zechaser or zelonen of zelochaser. Here we're talking about a case of, as the Gemara calls it, the Gemara says, what's the din in this case? Where zenen zelochaser, where I'm benefiting because I'm not paying rent, even though I was intending to. But I'm living in a property where you weren't planning on collecting rent. So says the Gemara, what's the din? Matzi Omar, can I argue? Matzi Omar le ma'chi sartich. What did I cause you to lose? You weren't planning on renting out your apartment anyway. Odilma, or perhaps maybe one can say that Matzi Amar, maybe one could argue, Ha'isanis, at the end of the day, even though you weren't planning on charging rent, I benefited by not paying rent. So Amar Le, in this discussion, when they asked the Shaila to the Rebbe, they got the answer. Mas Nisani. The answer is in a Mishnah. I must Nisan. We're on the top of Chaf Amid Beis, on the top line. Says the Gemara. Which Mishnah are we talking about? It says the Gemara, Amar Le, L'chiteshamishli, when you do something nice for me, then I'll tell you. So fine, he said, no problem. Shakil Sudre Karachle. Rami Bar Chama took the handkerchief and he folded it for him. Strange piece of Gemara, not for now. Says the Gemara, Amar Le, Im nenes meshalemes mashenenes. He says that the answer to the case of zenene v'zel lo chaser, of I who benefited because I did not pay rent, was living in your property, and you were not chaser because you weren't planning on collecting rent. Where do we learn that you're chayiv to pay in that case? We learn that from our Mishnah, where we see that an animal is chayiv to pay. Again, what he's chayiv to pay is machlokes, as we saw earlier, Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. But the Marim Makom is our Mishnah. Amar Rava. Rava says, Kama lo chali, below margish gaver the mari siyaya. A person he doesn't feel sick, he does not feel well. This is actually just a mashal to say that when you get all the help you need, you don't even ask any questions. He accepted this answer even though it doesn't make any sense. You can't compare our Mishnah, which says to the case of the squatting of the v'zen v'zelo chaser. Why? Because our Mishnah is zenena v'zeh chaser. In our Mishnah, it was not lo chaser, it was chaser. You ate my food. It's zenena v'zeh chaser. The high in our case is zenena v'zeh lo chaserhu. Our case is where you weren't even planning on charging rent. So the cases are not equal. Our Mishnah is zenene v'zeh chaser, and the case of me squatting in your apartment is zenene v'zeh lo chaser. Apples and oranges. The Rami Bar Chama, what would you say back to that? Why did Rami Bar Chama just accept this at face value, even though the cases have a clear distinction between them? And our Mishnah is not a good raya for the case of zenene v'zeh lo chaser, because our Mishnah is zenene v'zeh chaser. So this, the Gemara says, 8-9 lines down. What would Rami Bar Chama say? No. Of course, Rami Bar Chama is a smart, he's a massive Amora, knows exactly what he's talking about. The Gemara says, what would Rami Bar Chama say? Stam peros b'rshus harabim, afkure mifkar luhu. That when we're talking about in our Mishnah, where the animal has to pay, when we say v'zen nenes b'shalemes, that when he's a nene that he has to pay, that's even though the owner is really not losing. It is a case of zenene v'zelo chaser, because we assume that when fruits are in reshus harabim, that instantly the owner is mafkir, then he knows that animals are going to eat them. There's so many animals. It's not like our culture where we have cars. Their mode of transportation was donkeys, mules, and horses. Whenever the animals were eating everything they saw. So therefore, the cases are comparable. So now we need an answer to our question in regards to that Mishnah. What do we say the din is? The Gemara tries to give a response. Tnan, we have a Mishnah. We're 10 lines down on Chaf Amid Beis, going to the top line of Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph. Amakiv chaveiro mishalosh ruchosav. Take a look at the picture in Rashi that depicts this case. Let's say that Ruvain buys fields, and it surrounds Shimon's fields on 3 sides. The Gader es harishona v'es hashniya v'es hashlishis. And there's a wall that Ruvain builds in between Ruvain's fields and Shimon's fields to make sure the properties don't mix. Ein mechayven oso. We cannot obligate Ruvain, who paid for those 3 walls. He cannot obligate Shimon to pay. However, haravi is mechayven oso. If the 4th one is built, then he can be mechayven. Shmamina. What do we see from this case of the outside walls being built? I should say, more accurately, the walls in between Ruvain and Shimon's fields being built. So perhaps we have an answer to our question that where one is nehene and the other is lo chaser, then maybe the din is chayiv, and we have an answer to our question. Because we wanted to know about that case of zenene v'zeh lo chaser. Where I squat in your field, I'm nene, and you're not chaser. So to this, the Gemara says, no. Shani hasam do amar le at garmes li hakefa yisera. You can't learn from there because he can say, Reuven can argue to Shimon, the only reason I had to do this is because you had a field next to mine. But in our case, in the squatting case, maybe that case is not comparable because it's not a case of a forced hand. I went into your apartment without any conversation. It wasn't two fields next to one another. And therefore, maybe this is not a good raya for our case. So Tashma, let's try again. We're a third of the way down on your Testament base. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Im Amad Nikaf. The Gemara says if the Nikaf, the one that was surrounded, namely Shimon in the picture in Rashi, the Gadar is Haravis, if Shimon were to make the fourth wall, Megalgalon Alav Sakol, if Shimon makes that fourth wall, the one wall that's not built in Rashi's pictures, then all four walls have to be split over the two of them. Then Shimon's on the hook for splitting the cost of all the walls. Taima, but the reason why that's true, says this brisa, or a diuk from this brisa, is because the Gadar Nikaf, because that fourth fence was made by Shimon. However, Hamakiv, Pater, if the fourth wall was built by Ruvain and not by Shimon, then Shimon would have been Pater from paying. Shmamina, what can we infer from here? Zenenev is that lo chaser, Pater. We see over here that he's going to be Pater from paying in this case. So maybe we have an answer to our squatting question. The Gemara says, no, shiny hasam. So Amar Le, Shimon can argue, Lididi sagili binatira barzuza. Maybe the reason why Shimon is pater from paying in such a case is because he would say, you built a brick wall. I would have built a nothing little wall. I would have put a little pitzel fence there that I bought from Home Depot. I'm not building a brick wall, and I'm not paying you because you overdid it. So again, perhaps we don't have a raya to our case as to whether or not one would have to pay if I squatted in your property. Let's try again. The Gemara says, Tashma, a little bit more than a third of the way down. Abayis v'ha'aliyah shel shnayim shenaflu. It's a two flat. I own the upper apartment and you own the lower apartment. And the building fell down. Amar bal ha'aliyah lebal habayis. I own the upper floor and I say, listen, I want to build my apartment again. Please build your apartment on the base floor so I can build my apartment on the second floor. To go do your job, leave notes. Please build your building. However, the guy on the bottom floor doesn't want to rebuild. So what's the din? So the guy who owns the second floor, he can build the first floor, even though the first floor space doesn't really belong to him. He's allowed to build that, no problem, and he can live there until the owner of the first floor that from the building before it burned down, until the owner of the first floor pays for the cost of what the guy built. So I live on the second floor, you live on the first floor, building burns down. You don't want to rebuild the first floor? Fine, I'm going to rebuild the first floor and I'm going to live there, even though the physical space really should belong to you, until you pay me for my expenses, my yitzios, for what I paid for. This says the Gemara, yitzios of hu demechayev lebalabais. When you are paying me for that first floor so that I can now build my actual apartment above yours, you only have to pay me the costs, but the rent for the time, let's say I lived on that first floor space for 2 months, I don't have to pay you rent for that. What does the Gemara infer from here? Perhaps we can learn from here, Shema Mina, halfway down, Zenenev Zelo Chaser Pater. We have another case of an inference where we can infer that Zelo Nenev Zelo Chaser is Pater. As the Gemara, not a raya here either, because shiny hasam debesa le'aliyah mishtabe. This case is not a normal case. The case we were asking about was where I squatted in your apartment. This case is totally different. Maybe this case we're more lenient in regards to me building that first floor and not taking rent from you because you're being a jerk and you should have built your first floor so I could build my second floor. Maybe that's why the case is not comparable. And therefore the Gemara rejects that case as well. Tashma, let's try again. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we have someone who lives in the chutzner of his friend without his knowledge, very similar to our case. The din is that he has to pay rent. Says the Gemara, here we see that you're going to be chayiv in such a case, even though it's lo chaser. You weren't planning on doing anything with your field either way. Says the Gemara, shiny hasam. It's different in that case because perhaps in that case, mishum shachri rusa de ashaisa. Perhaps I'm living in your property for the first time and I'm going to ruin it. First person who lives in an apartment, he marks up all the walls, he makes the place all filthy dirty. And maybe that case is different. So Lemaisa, they didn't have an answer to this question of whether or not the case of Zenen and Vizelo Chaser is Chayiv or Potter. So they asked the Shaila. Says the Gemara, 3/4 of the way down. Shalche Bei Ravami. They sent a letter to Shalchuha, Bei Ravami. They sent him a letter. Amar V'chi ma asalo uma chaser uma hiziko. This is code word for saying Potter. If we were to tear this apart, we'd say, what did the guy do wrong? Big deal. He lived in your apartment. Nothing happened. If you came back to your apartment and you didn't know that he lived there, you're none the wiser. Who cares? What's the big deal? You're Potter. I need to sit and think about it. We've seen this line before in Shaf, and Lamaisa, he didn't want to give an answer at this point. Amar Hadar Shalchuha Kamed Reb Chia bar Abba. They sent another letter to Reb Chia bar Abba after he said, I want to think about it. And he got upset. Ilu ashkeche bataima lo shlachna lehu. If I would have thought of a good answer, I would have told you. Leave me alone. I don't know the answer to the question. So he didn't know the answer to the question. So right now we have two shitas. We have one shita that says, it's the shita of Rav Ami that says that Zenene v'zelo chaser is Potter. And then we have the second answer of Rav Chia bar Abba, which is not really an answer, which is that he doesn't know. The Gemara says 12 lines, 15 lines from the bottom, Itmar Rav Kahana. Amar Rav Yochanan, Eino tzarech lahalo schar. Rav Yochanan says you don't have to pay the rent. Rabbi Abo Amar Rav Yochanan. Rabbi Abo says in the name of Rav Yochanan, tzarech lahalo schar. So there's Rav Kahana and Rabbi Abahu argue in regards to what Rav Yochanan said. Amar Rav Papa, had Rabbi Abahu, this line of Rabbi Abahu that he said, that Rav Yochanan says you have to pay rent, lav beferish itmar. He didn't hear this explicitly from Rav Yochanan, ela mechlala itmar. He inferred it from another case, and maybe therefore Rabbi Abahu's answer is not as stark. What was the inference? It was based on a Mishnah. Ditnan. Not al even o koresh al hekdesh. Let's say the Gizbar, the treasurer of the Beis HaMikdash, who has some latitude in regards to moving around property that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. So he took a stone, he took a beam of hekdesh. He's allowed to have it in his own rishus because he's the gizbar, he's the treasurer. If he gives that rock or that beam of hekdesh to his friend, the gizbar violated the Isra of Me'ilah, but his friend did not violate the Isra of Me'ilah. If the gizbar builds it into his house, in order to violate the Isra of Me'ilah, the gizbar would have to live in the property for a moment's time, which would then be the Isra of using Me'ilah for a Shava Pruta. So then the Gemara says that and on this, this is not true if he builds it into his house. It's only true if he lays it on top of the aruba. If he builds it into his house as a support beam, we don't have to wait for the Shava Pruta to trigger for him to violate Me'ilah. He'll violate the Isser the second he puts it into his house. It must therefore be that he puts it on top of the aruba, that he put it on top of his skylight. The Gemara says 6 lines from the bottom. V'yasiv Rabbi Abahu kamed Rabbi Yochanan v'ka'amar mishmei de Shmuel. Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Shmuel Zoso Meres Hadar b'chotzer chavero shalom idaito tzarich lahalot lo schar. That he responded, this reminds me of the case of Chatzer Chavero Shalom Idaito. If I'm living in your property without permission, it seems to be that you'd have to pay rent. Just like if I live under that beam, I'd have to Shava Pruta, Chayav on Me'ilah. And what happened? V'shasakle, and he was quiet. And Savar, Ihu Savar, Rabbi Abo inferred from this silence the Midashasik Modele, that perhaps he's agreeing that this silence is Shtika Kyoda, and therefore you're going to be chayav to pay rent. It says the Gemara, Velohi, that's not true. Ashkuche lo ashkachbe. The Pasha didn't hear you talking, so you can't make any inferences about Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Abo has to be wrong. After all, Kid Rabba. Dama Rabba, Hektish Shalom Midas, Kehedyot Midas Dami. A sophisticated line. The Gemara says that if you have hektish that's being used shalom midas, it is treated kehedyot midas dami. And from here we would assume that you're going to be chayiv And that is therefore why we don't accept the Shita of Rabbi Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. He misunderstood based on silence. And what that means is we therefore assume, like the initial presentation of Rabbi Yochanan, 15 lines or so from the bottom on Chaf Amud Beis, which is the Shita of Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says that this is how it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch, Ein tzarech lahalo schar. That means that if I squat in your property, I was planning on paying rent. You were not planning on collecting rent. A typical case of zenene v'zeh lo chaser. The din is that you're putter. That's how it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch. We'll stop right here on the very top line of Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Mir Tashem will pick up in person tomorrow night. And we'll be learning from Mishmar La'artzenu in the back couple of tables in the base medrash. Wishing you all a beautiful night.